Perhaps the greatest engineer that Britain ever had, Isambard Kingdom Brunel was a visionary whose projects revolutionized transportation and infrastructure during the Industrial Revolution. Born in Portsmouth, England, Brunel's innovative designs transformed railways, ships, bridges, with landmark achievements such as the Great Western Railway, the SS Great Britain, and the Clifton Suspension Bridge, serving as enduring testaments to his ingenuity. His ability to overcome monumental technical challenges and push the boundaries of engineering not only set new standards in safety and efficiency, but also laid the groundwork for our modern construction practices. His bold vision, partnered with a relentless pursuit of excellence, continue to inspire generations of engineers to come, cementing his legacy as one of the most influential figures in the history of industrial innovation. Hello everyone. Today it's not about the warriors. It's not about the kings. It's about the builders. It's not about the conquerors or even the scientists. It's about the people who make the roads, get us across the rivers, and the greatest of all was, well, you already know the introduction. So get relaxed. Today we're going to talk about Isambard Kingdom Brunel, and in the greatest of detail. Oh, and like and subscribe if you want to as well, or I'll see you on the Patreon. Let us begin. Isambard Kingdom Brunel, born in Britain Street, Portsea, April 9, 1809, within Portsmouth, Hampshire. This was the location where his father was quite busy managing the machinery used for producing pulley blocks, certainly from a background of industry, and certainly at a time when industry was booming. His mother, Sophia Kingdom, gave him the name Kingdom, while his father, Marc Isambard Brunel, a French civil engineer, gave him the name Isambard. Oh, his mother was of English stock, by the way. Now, Thomas Mudge, Jr., whose father was renowned horologist Thomas Mudge, was married to his maternal aunt, Elizabeth Kingdom. Sophia was the oldest of Brunel's two older sisters along with Emma, but due to his father's work obligations, and obliged he was, the whole family had to pack up all of their things and move to the big city, London, arriving in 1808. Despite the family's frequent financial difficulties, Brunel seemed to have had quite a happy childhood, at least as happy as you can for 1808, with his father mentoring his early education, certainly giving him a background in the industrial arts. Having started sketching and observational skills instruction from his father at the age of 4, he had already mastered the Euclidean geometry by the time he was 8. Brunel learned of the fundamentals of engineering and became fluent in French during this time too. But that wasn't all. He also showed a notable ability, not only for mathematics, but mechanics, certainly following in his father's footsteps. Thus he was encouraged to design interesting buildings, while also pointing out the structural flaws of existing ones. Quite a hobby for an 8-year-old boy. Of course, at this time, he had begun to study the classics. After being assigned to Dr. Morell's boarding school in Hove, it was time for a more formal education. Marc Brunel, who was French by birth, was adamant that his son have the same rigorous education that he had received in France. Therefore, the younger Brunel continued his education at the University of Cannes, before enrolling at the Lycée Henri IV in Paris at the age of 14. When he had turned 15 years old, Brunel witnessed his father's incarceration in a debtor's prison. The sum was exceeding £5,000. After 3 months passed without the slightest prospect of release, his father signaled his willingness to accept an employment offer from the Tsar of Russia. Alarmed at the thought of losing a prominent engineer, the British government relented in August of 1821, providing Marc with £5,000 to settle the debt. But there was the condition: he had to remain in Britain. After concluding his studies at Lycée Henri IV in 1822, Brunel was formally put forward by his father for admission to the renowned engineering institution École Polytechnique. However, it didn't go as planned. His application was rejected on the grounds that he was not a French citizen. Technicalities, I suppose. Subsequently, he apprenticed with the eminent clockmaker and horologist Abraham Louis Breguet, who spoke highly of Brunel's aptitude in letters to his father. Once this apprenticeship was completed, Brunel returned to England in late 1822. He then spent several years thereafter as an assistant engineer on the ambitious Thames Tunnel scheme, intended to construct an underground passage between Rotherhithe and Wapping in London. Working on perilous conditions, labourers sought to drive a horizontal tunnel from one bank of the river to the other. The project was financed by the Thames Tunnel Company, and Brunel's father, Marc Brunel, served as its chief engineer. The American naturalist recorded that it is stated that the operations of the Teredo shipworm suggested to Mr. Brunel his method of tunnelling the Thames. At Rotherhithe, the riverbed frequently consisted of loose gravel and saturated soil, although Marc Brunel's ingenious tunnelling shield helped protect workers from collapses. 2 serious flooding events led to prolonged work stoppages, resulting in multiple fatalities, and leaving the younger Brunel badly injured. In the second flood of 1828, the project's 2 most senior miners lost their lives, and as for Brunel, he barely made it out. After a 6-month recuperation from his injuries, he turned his focus to designing a bridge in Bristol, a plan that would ultimately materialize as the Clifton Suspension Bridge. But this disastrous episode, however, caused tunnel construction to remain on hold for an extended period. It wasn't bad enough there was the first flooding event. The second, well, it's very hard to talk your way out of that one. Although the Thames Tunnel was ultimately finished during Marc Brunel's lifetime, Isambard's direct involvement ended once he used the deserted Rotherhithe site solely to continue his fruitless gas experiments. Marc Brunel had devised a plan for an engine powered by alternatively heating and cooling carbon dioxide produced from ammonium carbonate with sulfuric acid, which is the most 19th century thing you could do. That is absolutely ridiculous. Well, you have to use what you have, I suppose. Despite initial interest from both the Admiralty and other parties, the tests were eventually halted after 1834, when Brunel deemed the venture unsuccessful due to its inefficient fuel consumption. One can imagine that the economy of that would not be very suitable at all. The Thames Tunnel was bought for £200,000 rather, by the East London Railway Company in 1865, and the first trains went through it 4 years later. The tunnel was later added to the London Underground system, and guess what? They're still using it. That's right. It's still the same tunnel. Originally constructed as a section of the East London Line, it's now part of the London Overground. But perhaps Brunel's most well-known designs are the Clifton Suspension Bridge in Bristol, which started in 1831. Brunel's design served as the basis for the bridge's construction, although there were some notable modifications. At the time of its construction, it was the longest bridge in the world, spanning at over 700 feet, and ostensibly 249 feet above the River Avon. A committee led by Thomas Telford received 4 designs from Brunel. However, Telford rejected all of the submissions and suggested his own design. But due to a strong public opposition, the organizing committee had to hold a new competition, and guess what? Telford did not win that one. Rather, Brunel did. I go on to quote about the time. "Of all the wonderful feats I have performed since I have been in this part of the world, I think yesterday I performed the most wonderful," Brunel wrote to his brother-in-law, politician Benjamin Hawes, saying, "I produced unanimity among 15 men who were quarrelling about that most ticklish subject, taste." The Queen Square riots that followed Sir Charles Wetherell's arrival in Clifton in 1831 put a halt to the bridge's construction, and it stopped completely as a result of the riots driving away its investors, who simply left no money left for the project. No money, no bridge. Although Brunel did not live to see the bridge fully completed, his institution of civil engineers and colleagues and admirers thought it would be a fitting memorial, and began to make additional funds to make design changes. 3 years after Brunel's passing in 1862, work did resume, and finally in 1864, it was finished. It's been suggested that Brunel did not design the bridge, although it was ultimately constructed because of significant design modifications made later. And here we get to that ship of Theseus theory. Now, if we take one plank away from the ship of Theseus, is it still the ship of Theseus? If we take all of the planks away, is it still the ship of Theseus? Same goes for the bridge. If they've made so many design changes, changed so many things, is it still Brunel's bridge? Interesting. Well, these opinions are in line with what Tom Rolt had said in his 1959 book, Brunel, 52 years earlier than the newer claims had been made in 2011 by Adrian Vaughan. Brunel's design could not be precisely followed for a number of reasons, you see, including the re-engineering of suspension chains that were recovered from an earlier suspension bridge. In May of 1845, Hungerford Bridge, a suspension footbridge over the Thames close to London's Charing Cross station, opened. It cost £106,000 and had a central span of 676 feet. In 1859, a new railway bridge took its place, and the Clifton Suspension Bridge was finished using the suspension chains. Now, every year, there are more than 4 million vehicles that cross the Clifton Suspension Bridge, which still stands strong. So I guess you could say that it is a fitting testament to Brunel's legacy. It's good that it's still there. Perhaps if you are in the area, perhaps you'd like to take a little drive over the bridge. That'll be a little bit of homework for you. Now, onto the railways, which is really the quintessential 19th century construction. For his railway projects, Brunel created a large number of bridges, such as the Windsor Railway Bridge, the Maidenhead Railway Bridge over the Thames in Berkshire, the Royal Albert Bridge over the River Tamar at Saltash near Plymouth, and Somerset Bridge, an unusual laminated timber-framed bridge close to Bridgewater. Even though modern trains are roughly 10 times heavier than those of Brunel's day, this last bridge, which was the flattest and widest brick arch bridge in the world, continues to transport mainline trains to the west. During his career as a railway builder, Brunel used a lot of wood to build large viaducts, especially on the South Devon and Cornwall railways, where there were many valleys to cross and the economy was required. Over time, These had to be replaced because their main material, Baltic pine, had become too expensive to obtain. After Parliament rejected Brunel's initial plan for a train ferry across Hamouse, the estuary of the tidal Tamar, Tavy, and Linner, he created the Royal Albert Bridge for the Cornwall Railway in 1855. The bridge, which is made of bowstring girders or tied arches, has two main spans that are 455 feet and 100 feet above the mean high spring tide. There are also 17 much shorter approach spans. It was finished the year of Brunel's passing and opened by Prince Albert on May 2nd, 1859. Due to the Great Western Railway's electrification and the lack of clearance for overhead wires, Brunel may have to demolish a number of its bridges over the line. In order to save the 9 historic bridges that are still in the line, Buckingham County Council is negotiating to have additional options explored. We'll have to see how all of that goes. Well, on Brunel's recommendation, the Cornwall Railway Company built 42 river crossings in the form of wooden viaducts, with timber deck spans supported by fans of timber bracing built on masonry piers. When they built a railway line between Plymouth and Truro, opening in 1859 and extending to Falmouth in 1863. Compared to an all-masonry structure, this unconventional construction method significantly decreased the initial cost of construction, but at the expense of more costly maintenance. The final timber viaducts were built by Brunel and demolished and replaced with masonry structures later on in 1934. The distinctive Three Bridges London was Brunel's final significant project. The project was finished in 1859, having started in 1856. The Grand Junction Canal, Great Western and Brentford Railway, and Windmill Lane routes are still able to cross each other thanks to the arrangements of the 3 bridges in question. Now that certainly lasted the test of time. Early in Brunel's life, railroads started to gain popularity as a significant mode of transportation for cargo. Brunel's involvement in railway engineering, including railway bridge engineering, was of course impacted by this. He was named Chief Engineer of the Great Western Railway, one of the wonders of Victorian Britain, running from London to Bristol and then Exeter in 1833, before the Thames Tunnel was finished. In 1835, the company was incorporated by an Act of Parliament after being established at a public meeting in Bristol, 1833. Brunel's idea was for travellers to buy a single ticket at London Paddington and take the Great Western Railway to New York, switching to the Great Western steamship at the terminus in Nayland, West Wales. With the assistance of numerous people, including his solicitor Jeremiah Osborne of Bristol law firm Osborne Clark, who once rowed Brunel down the River Avon to survey the riverbank for the route, he personally surveyed the whole length of the route between London and Bristol. Brunel even created the design for the Bath's Royal Hotel, which debuted across from the train station in 1846. Brunel made 2 controversial choices. He decided to build the track with a broad gauge of 7 feet and 1/4 inch, that is 2,140 millimeter, because he thought it would provide better running at high speeds, and he chose to follow the Thames Valley into London after passing north of the Marlborough Downs, an area devoid of major towns but with possible connections to Oxford and Gloucester. Since practically all British railways up to this point had adopted standard gauge, his choice to use broad gauge for the line was controversial. According to Brunel, this was merely a holdover from the minor railways that George Stephenson had constructed before creating the first passenger railway in history. You see, within mines, of course, you have different gauges, passenger trains being a lot larger. Through calculations and a series of experiments, Brunel demonstrated that his wider gauge was the ideal size for offering passengers a stable and comfortable ride, in addition to faster speeds. Additionally, the large goods wagons and increased freight capacity were made possible by the wider gauge, bigger trains, bigger cargo. The Great Western featured a number of technical innovations too, including viaducts like the one at Ivy Bridge, specifically constructed stations and tunnels like the Box Tunnel, which at the time was the longest railway tunnel in the world. Just keeps smashing records in Victorian Britain. I love it. These were all based on Brunel's experience with the Thames Tunnel. On June 30th, 1841, the line from London to Bristol was finished and prepared for trains with the opening of the Box Tunnel. 28-year-old Daniel Gooch, later Sir Daniel, was appointed superintendent of locomotive engines after the first batch of locomotives Brunel ordered to his own specifications, aside from the North Star locomotive, proved to be inadequate. At the village of Swindon, where the gentle climb from London became steeper to drop to the Avon Valley at Bath, Brunel and Gooch decided to set up their locomotive works. Following Brunel's passing, it was decided that all of the nation's railroads should use standard gauge. A variety of Brunel's life is depicted on information boards at Neyland, the original Welsh terminus of the Great Western Railway, where sections of the broad gauge rail are used as handrails at the quayside. A life-size bronze statue of him, with a locomotive in one hand and a steamship in the other, is also present. Good spot for photos. But following an earlier theft, believe it or not, the statue has been replaced. Brunel created the current Paddington Station in London, which debuted in 1854. His designs for smaller stations on the Great Western and related lines, such as Culham, Mortimer, Charlbury, and Bridgend, have survived, and in very good condition at that. Frome and Kingswear have surviving examples of his style of wooden train sheds too. Numerous artifacts from Brunel's time on the Great Western Railway can be found at the Swindon Railway Museum. Brunel's 7-foot quarter-inch of track has been restored at the Didcot Railway Centre, and steam locomotives in the same gauge are in operation still. But of course the railways were seen negatively by some sections of society. Not everyone's happy. They never are. Some landowners asked for tunnels to be built on their property so that a railway would not be visible, while others believed that railways threatened amenities or property values. It seems that we're having the same problems in these days with infrastructure, the not in my backyard crowd. But you imagine just the entitlement of saying, can you build a railway tunnel so I don't hear or see the railway under my house? Do they have any idea how much money it takes to build a railway tunnel? They'd still complain about the rattling from underground, surely. Now, the atmospheric railway, which was actually the South Devon Railway but was backed by the Great Western Railway, was another one of Brunel's unsuccessful attempts to use technological advancements. It was an extension of the Great Western that ran south from Exeter to Plymouth. Clegg and Samuda's patented atmospheric vacuum traction system, which used stationary pumps to draw air from a pipe positioned in the middle of the track, moved the trains in place of locomotives. Quite a novel idea. On this basis, the section between Exeter and Newton was finished, with trains operating at about 68 miles an hour, just about 110 kilometers an hour. At intervals of 2 miles, pumping stations were positioned with recognizable square chimneys. On the level areas, 15-inch pipes were used, while the steeper gradients were designed for 22-inch pipes. Because of this technology, the vacuum pipes had to be sealed with leather flaps. The vacuum removed the leather natural oil, leaving it susceptible to moisture, which caused it to deteriorate and break its fibers when it froze in the winter of 1847. And here's another thing. Rats are drawn to tallow, and they had to use that to keep it supple. Ugh. Vacuum operators lasted less than a year. From 1847, experimental service had started in September. Operation started in February 1848. But to the 10th of September 1848, all of the flaps were eaten away by the rats. The continuous valve started to tear from its own rivets over the majority of its length, and the estimated replacement cost was £25,000, and nobody was keen to replace that. This degradation, which was caused by the reaction of tannin and iron oxide, has been cited as the final straw that brought the project to a complete halt. All in all, the system was never able to establish its worth. According to the SDR's 1848 accounts, atmospheric traction cost 3 shillings and 1 penny per mile, while conventional steam costs a lot less. However, due to the numerous operational problems with the atmospheric, few of which were resolved during its operational life, it was simply impossible to determine the true cost efficiency. There are still a number of South Devon Railway engine houses, such as the ones at Totnes, designated as a monument in 2007. Grade 2, nonetheless. There's also one at Starcross. Prior to the Great Western Railway's opening in 1835, Brunel had suggested expanding its transportation system by boat from Bristol across the Atlantic Ocean to New York City. For that reason, Thomas Guppy established the Great Western Steamship Company. It was hotly debated whether a ship that ran entirely on steam could make such long voyages profitable. Longer voyages were made possible by technological advancements in the 1830s, such as the surface condenser, which enabled boilers to operate on salt water without pausing to be cleaned. As you can imagine, that makes a huge difference. However, it was widely believed that a ship would not have enough space for commercial cargo, and not enough fuel for the journey. Brunel used Beaufoy's experimental data to support his theory that a ship's carrying capacity increased as its dimensions increased by a cube, while its resistance it faced from the water during travel only increased by a square of its dimensions. Accordingly, a larger ship would require proportionately lower amounts of fuel to move a smaller ship. Brunel volunteered his services to the Great Western Steamship Company in order to test this theory. He was appointed to the company's building committee and given the task of designing the Great Western, the company's first ship. At 236 feet, with a 250-foot keel, the Great Western was the longest ship in the world when it was constructed. Although the ship was mostly made of wood, Brunel strengthened its keel by adding bolts and iron diagonal reinforcements. The ship had 4 masts for sails and paddle wheels that ran on steam. On April 8, 1838, the Great Western sailed for the first time, carrying 600 long tons of coal, cargo, and 7 passengers from Avonmouth, Bristol to New York. Due to injuries he sustained in a ship fire while returning from fitting out in London, Brunel himself was unable to make the first crossing. I'm sure you can imagine how disappointed he was at that. The Great Western lost the chance to become the first ship to sail the Atlantic on steam power alone, since the fire postponed the launch for a few days. The rival, Sirius, arrived just 1 day earlier, having all but depleted its coal supply despite having a 4-day lead. Brunel's calculations proved to be accurate, however, as the Great Western crossing of the Atlantic took 15 days and 5 hours, and the ship reached her destination with 1/3 of her coal still in place. From 1838 to 1846, the Great Western Steamboat Company regularly used the Great Western between Bristol and New York after she demonstrated the feasibility of commercial transatlantic steamship service. With a crossing time of 13 days westbound and 12 days 6 hours eastbound, she completed 64 crossings and became the first ship to hold the blue riband. Due to the service's tremendous commercial success, Brunel was of course asked to design another sister ship. He had come to believe that ships with propellers were better than those with paddle wheels. He included a large 6-bladed propeller in his design for the 322-foot Great Britain, which was launched in 1848, following the tests on propeller-driven steamship Archimedes. Because it was constructed of metal rather than wood, propelled by an engine rather than wind or oars, propelled by a propeller rather than a paddle wheel, Great Britain is regarded as the first real modern ship. And once again breaking more records, 322 feet. The boats just keep getting bigger, don't they? So she sailed from Liverpool to New York for the first time in August and September of 1845. But she was run aground in Dundrum, County Down in 1846. After being saved, she joined the Australian military. In Bristol, UK, she is now completely preserved and accessible to the general public. There's another tourist attraction for you. Take the trip down. Larger than her predecessors, Brunel turned to a third ship in 1852 for trips to Australia and India. At nearly 700 feet in length, equipped with the most opulent amenities, and able to accommodate more than 4,000 passengers, the Great Eastern, originally known as the Leviathan, represented state-of-the-art technology for the era. Because engineers at the time thought Australia had no coal reserves, how wrong they were. Great Eastern was built to cruise non-stop from London to Sydney and back. Until the early 1900s, she was the biggest ship ever built. Due to a number of technical issues, however, the ship quickly went over budget and behind schedule, just like many of Brunel's more ambitious projects. But like we say, you've got to risk it for the biscuit. Although the ship had been called the White Elephant, it has been argued that Brunel's failure in this instance was primarily due to economics. His ships were just years ahead of their time, according to some. Large-scale, propeller-driven, all-metal steamships could be built thanks to his engineering vision and innovation, but, well, it would take several decades for the transoceanic steamship travel to become profitable business due to the industrial and economic conditions that prevailed at the time. Built at London's Napier Yard by John Scott Russell, the Great Eastern made her first voyage from Liverpool to New York on June 17, 1860, following 2 test runs in 1859. Despite her initial failure at passenger travel, she eventually found employment as a cable layer for the Oceanic Telegraph. Gotta do something. The Great Eastern was instrumental in establishing the first long-lasting transatlantic telegraph cable, which allowed communication between Europe and North America under the command of Captain Sir James Anderson. An old Turkish barracks in Scutari became the British Army hospital when Britain entered the Crimean War in 1854. Because of the unfavorable conditions there, injured men became ill with cholera, typhoid, malaria, you name it, they had it. Florence Nightingale was actually at this hospital, actually. She wrote to the Thames pleading with the government to come up with a remedy. And guess who answered? In February of 1855, Brunel took on the task of designing and constructing a temporary, prefabricated hospital that could be simply transported to Crimea and set up there, despite his other projects, including the Great Eastern. And in just 5 months, the group he put together created, constructed, and shipped prefabricated buildings made of canvas and wood, along with guidance on how to move and position the facilities. But you can't always rely on the instructions. You just got to get started, right? I never read the instructions. Now at this time, Brunel had been working on the Great Eastern's launch stage with William Easy of Gloucester Docks. The British and French armies in the Crimea, as well as the Australian gold rush, used the wooden prefabricated huts that Easy had designed and constructed. 18 out of the 50 patient wards Brunel designed were constructed by Easy using wood from timber importers Price & Co. and transported straight to the Dardanelles from Gloucester Docks via 16 ships. In the malaria-free region of Renkioi, the Renkioi Hospital was later built close to Scutari Hospital. That was the one where Nightingale was stationed at. Access to sanitary facilities, ventilation, drainage, and even basic temperature controls. All of these things were all included in his designs, so you can definitely see how groundbreaking all of this was. And of course they were hailed as a huge success, because according to some reports only 50 died out of the 1,300 or so patients that were treated there. The death rates before were something around 45%, I think, from memory. You might have to watch the Florence Nightingale video to hear about that. They were known as those magnificent huts by Nightingale. That's how she would refer to them. But even today, hospitals like the Bristol Royal Infirmary are constructed using prefabricated modules. The practice has not gone away. Even when we were having that situation in 2019 to 2022, those hospitals they were building for emergency purposes were all prefabricated. Under John Fox Burgoyne's encouragement, Brunel submitted designs for floating gun batteries to the Admiralty in 1854 and 55. These were designed to attack Russian ports as siege weapons. However, Brunel's belief that the Admiralty was against new ideas was unfortunately confirmed when these proposals were simply shrugged off. Didn't want to change the old ways. Well, in 1843, while entertaining his children with a conjuring trick, Brunel inhaled a half-sovereign coin by mistake, which lodged in his windpipe. I bet you didn't see that coming, didn't you? Easy mistake. Neither Brunel's machine to shake it loose, nor a special piece of forceps were able to remove it. The coin was finally jerked free after Brunel was strapped to a board and turned upside down to his father's suggestion. After recovering at Tynemouth, he bought an estate at Watcombe in Torquay, Devon, because he just loved the place so much. Here he hired William Byrne to create a design for his country residence. He was good at designing the industrial stuff, but, not too good at housing, I suppose. It was called Brunel Manor, and it had a beautiful garden, to which Brunel spent much time in, well, at least while it was being constructed. It wasn't finished. He passed away before he could see that. He never saw the finished product. Well, just before the Great Eastern's maiden trip to New York on September in 1859, Brunel, who was a heavy smoker, was diagnosed with Bright's disease, also called nephritis, and he had a stroke. Like his father, he was buried in London's Kensal Green Cemetery, after passing away 10 days later at the age of 53. At Westminster Abbey, a window of the south side have honours of him. Despite, and as a result of Brunel's business endeavours, many lamented his death, and there was an obituary in the Morning Chronicle. It read like this: Sadly, Brunel was not the best choice for shareholders. Even though he was the right man for the country, Brunel could never stop, and they must stoop to get gold. No grand novelty so audaciously conceived and successfully executed by the same person are documented in the history of invention. So, all in all, he was a renowned engineer in his time. We still remember him as such. You can see a lot of monuments that attest to this that are still up today. You can find them in Bristol, Swindon, Plymouth, Saltash, all over the place. There's even a university named after him. In August 2010, a statue in Nayland, Pembrokeshire, the one that we mentioned, was actually stolen. Well, as far as I know, we're yet to find that yet. At the entrance of the Liverpool Football Club Stadium, Anfield, the Great Eastern's top mast serves as a flagpole. Brunel's name is still used in places like Brunel University in London, shopping malls in Swindon and Bletchley, Milton Keynes. A group of streets in Exeter are also called Isambard Terrace, Kingdom Mews and Brunel Close. In his hometown of Portsmouth, one of the biggest pubs in the city is named after him, and there's nothing better than a good pub, as is a road, a parking lot, and a school. And finally, the University of Plymouth has an engineering lab that bears his name too. And that is the end of the life of Isambard Brunel. So what did you think? A little bit out of the regular programming we have on here. We always, like I said at the start, talk about the kings, talk about all those great warriors and the conquerors and all the rest. But sometimes it's not quite them who really build the world. And say what you like about the blue-collar man, those bridges, those railways, they're still here. Now, I am going to thank the people who have constructed the success of this channel in some ways by keeping me going. Those are the patrons, and the members on YouTube, all lovely people. Dark, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Carey, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfednir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuronerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Stark Factory, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Video Man, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stephen, Kevin, the HMS HH, Crystal, and Talbury. Thank you all very much for supporting. Now, hopefully by this time this video is released, we are perhaps at 100,000 subs. I hope we are. If not, well then perhaps my estimations were not quite correct. Perhaps I should have got someone like Brunel to make those sorts of estimations. Might have been a bit more accurate. But in any case, I will once again wish you lots of love to every one of you. And until we next meet, good night.